Hey everybody, I think we should get started. It is my great joy and privilege to introduce Bruno Goncalves, who is visiting with us as to give a lecture at the data science program. I'm going to read this off because he has so many affiliations that are both important and interesting. And I want to make sure we get anything wrong. Right now, he's a data science fellow at NYU's Center for Data Science while on leave from a 10-year position at Aix-Marseille University. His expertise is in using large-scale data sets to study socioeconomic phenomena, including languages. I've known Bruno since his time here, and I'm using most of it actually personally known. In fact, it was Bruno who started collecting the first Twitter data that we've all been using in our analysis. In fact, some of the papers that I'm writing right now still use data. Right, Bruno. So I'm forever in this debt for not just collecting the data, but also writing some fantastic papers, very insightful papers about the analysis. You'll be presenting today about sort of the seven languages of the world and about multilingualism. Very happy to report that the Dutch language area is very prominently featured on these maps.
There is a map of Belgium.
There is a map of Belgium, even in this it's more gratifying all in all. I should also say that Bruno has 60 plus publications, 5,200 citations in Google Scholar, and an H index of 30, which makes me very jealous. And so I'm really interested to see what he has to tell about the latest and greatest.
Thank you, Andrew. You're much too kind as always. And thank you, Ingrid, for inviting me and everyone for being here. The opportunity to present some of my works, or more specifically, some of my collaborators' works, that I don't actually do anything. I just travel and give talks as much as possible. So today I'm going to talk to you a little bit about some things I've done using geolocated data, and in particular geolocated Twitter data, and as a way of looking at languages and what people speak and how they speak it. No, but this one is the one connected there. Yep. And this data, of course, all comes from the internet, which is this strange place where people write on walls and worship cats. But by doing that, what they're actually doing, in fact, as a consequence of this wall writing and cat worshipping, is that they're generating huge amounts of text and huge amounts of information about how people communicate with one another and how they interact and exchange ideas, and also exchange cat pictures. Of course, forever people have been complaining that technology keeps making us all antisocial, but the truth is, all of these tools and technologies, what they're actually doing is they are specifically designed with the social aspect in mind. They are specifically designed to connect us in some way and allow us to share some of our social interactions through them to some degree. And of course, each tool and each network somehow specializes on a specific aspect of behavior. So on Facebook, you might say you like the cat. On Twitter, you say you're playing with your cat. On YouTube, you watch cat videos. On Google Plus, you say you work for Google and have a cat. So each of them kind of captures different aspects. Now, on top of this, for a few years now also, people have had these fancy phones that they're able to carry around in their pockets. and these fancy phones, among other things, like video calls and all those things. This is actually, this is from a New Yorker magazine in the 1930s or something, where they're trying to imagine the future. And so this is their vision of telephones in the future. So you can think of it as being iPhone version 0.1. You also needed a huge battery like you do now, so carry around that, be able to use it. But anyway, so now you have all of these fancy phones, and of course, each of these phones now has a GPS receiver, so you can have very precise information on where people are, like very well fine-grained information. And not only that, of course, there are a few billion people in the world, and a huge fraction of those are actually able to have access to some type of social service through their phones. So you can see that just by looking at this, you're able to tap and to see a huge fraction of the world's population and what they're doing almost in real time. So when in Twitter you ask people to follow you, that might be taken a little bit too literally, and you can actually see, people can actually see where you are and what you're doing if you decide to share your location information. So this is data for a real user over the course of about 2 years. And what you see is basically everything about his life for those 2 years. Like you know that he lives in London more or less, he travels to Paris a lot, he went to Corsica at some point, had a nice vacation in Kenya, had a nice vacation also in South Africa, at some point he went to New York, and then he went back to London. Now, of course, this is not the typical user. I chose this person in particular because it had many check-ins in many different places, so it made for a nice fancy picture and animation. But the point I'm making here is that while this is one specific case and it's an anecdote, if you have a few 100 million of people doing this type of information sharing, you're able to build a much more comprehensive picture of the world. So what we have here is actually not a map. This is just a matrix in latitude and longitude space. So in each side of this matrix, I'm just counting how many tweets are geolocated to that little block of latitude and longitude. And immediately you can see two things. You can see first how detailed the data is. You can, if you look carefully, you can see, for example, the Nile River over there. You can see roads going through the desert in Saudi Arabia. You can see the Orient Express going through Siberia, etc. So you get these very fine, detailed pictures. And there's about 2 billion tweets there. On the other hand, you also see that this data has intrinsic limitations. Right? You see, for example, that Africa is very empty, other than a few Nigerian princes over there. Siberia is mostly empty, but that's also true. China, of course, doesn't have much outside the major cities with more tourists, also because it's slightly illegal to use Twitter in China, etc. So you see both the power of the data and also the limitations of the data. And you see also that how in a sense, the quality of the data varies a lot from one place to the other. This, of course, limits what type of questions and what type of works you can do with the data. And you also have to keep in mind all the limitations of the data and all the biases. And of course, Twitter has an endless number of biases. But the power of this data is that because it is so detailed and it is so abundant, especially in the Western world, you're actually able to ask questions at different levels of resolution. Right? You can look at the continent level, country level, region level, city level, even neighborhood level if you want. And of course, you can see I work with Italians because all the maps revolve around Italy. Now, but like I mentioned in the beginning, one of the things I'm interested in is not only on the geolocated aspects of things, but also on language. Right? So how do you add language to this? And the way you do it is basically you need some way you're detecting language. So if you're familiar with Google Chrome, you've seen something like this. You go to a website written in some strange and foreign language, like Catalan, and Chrome looks at it and says, look, I know you don't speak Catalan. Would you like me to translate this to English? And then you press yes, and magically it gets translated. Fortunately, Chrome has an open source version called Chromium, which is blue. And some crazy guy somewhere went to all the trouble of digging through the source code of Chromium and basically extracting the library that does the language detection and published it as a standalone package that you can use. So you install this, and then you have a little piece of code that you give it a line of text or a paragraph or whatever you want, and it tells you what language it's written. Not only that, it tells you how sure it is that that's the right language. So you can tell him something and it will say, okay, I'm 95% sure this is English, 3% sure it's Italian, and 2% sure it's Spanish. So you can put the threshold that you want to be as sure as you want. So for the rest, whenever I talk about languages in Twitter, I'm following this definition of language, is what Google tells me the language is, and Chrome is at least 95% sure that that's that language. So I put a relatively high threshold. So when you combine all the geolocated data with this language layer, you can make maps like this. And when you look at this map, other than all the shiny colors, you discover something amazing. You find out that people in Portugal speak Portuguese, people in Spain speak Spanish, in France speak French, in England speak English, in Italy speak Italian, in Germany speak German, etc. So what this means, of course, is that I'm not completely crazy, which I have my doubts sometimes, you never know. And that we're actually doing something that's meaningful, and is actually able to capture something. And if we're starting to see random results in this type of plot, we will know that there will be something wrong. Now, to make Johan happy, we can actually look more carefully at Belgium over there. I can't just talk about Belgium all the time. I don't even like Belgium that much. So here, one of the nice things you can do also, you can define the boundaries between languages, right? And in Belgium, this is very clear. You see clearly where the French area is, where the Flemish area is, and exactly almost where the border between the two regions are. It's really, really nice. On the other hand, if you look at Catalonia, you can see that there isn't really a big distinction between where Spanish is spoken and where Catalan is spoken. There, you have a much more predominant Catalan speakers in smaller towns, like Girona, but in the big cities, you kind of have a mixture of both. So the picture is much more muddled in a sense. And of course, you could also play this game at a much lower resolution, even within the cities. Give an example. So here's a map of Manhattan. And you could look at basically where English is spoken at night. So these are tweets written in English between 8 p.m. and 8 a.m. Or 8 p.m. and 6 a.m. So basically nighttime. And compare that with tweets written in Spanish in the same period, and you see basically that the two communities tend to live in different areas. So you can also use this somehow as a way of detecting and have an idea of where different communities live within the city, which is something I'm going to talk a lot more about in a second. But before that, let me get started with something else. So I've been talking about all of these languages and the boundaries between languages. So now let's focus on one specific language, in this case Spanish, and look at more detail at how it's spoken and how the way it is spoken changes from one place to the other. Now, historically, people have been interested in this, like how different words and different expressions are used in different places. So this is a work by Joshua Katz in North Carolina State University, which is a real linguist, not the physicist, but any real linguist. And the way they do this is basically they drive around the country and interview people and ask them questions. Particularly, like, what is the generic term for a sweet and carbonated beverage? And of course, some people say soda, some people say pop, some say Coke, some say soft drink, and different areas will prefer different expressions. So in the end, so there tends to be pop between pop and soda. No, pop and Coke. Now, of course, I don't like that much to drive around and ask people strange questions. So one of the things we try to do is how can you do this automatically? And one of the reasons you want to do this automatically is because every time you interact with someone and you ask somebody a question, you might be inadvertently influencing them. Right? So this is literally the textbook example, because I stole this from a textbook in sociology. And basically what we have here is the person from the census that's interviewing the person living in that house. And he says, okay, so final question, what do you generally think about the polls? He says, well, frankly, I think there are too many of them. Also, I think they often become self-fulfilling prophecies. People often can't help but be influenced by them. And so the census person says, well, actually, Mike, that's something of a misconception. In the recent poll, 99% of respondents indicated that polls have no effect on their opinion. Mike goes, oh, well, maybe I'm wrong. Well, why don't I just put you as undecided? So just by this simple exchange, even without necessarily meaning to, you kind of influencing the other person to change the answer in one way or the other. And actually, one of my jobs as an undergrad was actually working for a polling company where I would cold call people and try to convince them to give me answers. And you can, depending on how you phrase the question and how you ask the question, the person is more likely to answer, less likely to answer. You might kind of push them a little bit in one direction or the other if you want to do that type of stuff. So I decided to basically try to do something like that, but in a more automated way. For that, I grabbed all the tweets I had in Spanish with geolocation. We have a nice pretty map there. And then I started saying, okay, we can get a list of words and for different types of concepts. So here we have examples, one for bus, one for car, and basically different words that mean bus and car in Spanish, and that are recognized by the Cervantes Institute as being equivalent, like it can be used interchangeably. And what you see here is basically how common each word is in each location. So, and immediately you see some interesting patterns. So for example, you have this yellow area over there, this green area over here that is not present in this map. Here you have this big red chunk south of Brazil, which is different than what's happening like north of Brazil, let's say. Well, here you don't, it's all the same. So you can see that this kind of varies from one concept of one word to another. So you can do this for a few dozen words, or around a few dozen concepts, which correspond to a couple hundred different words. You count all of them, you see where each of them is dominant inside. So you divide the word again into little cells. For each cell, you see for each concept which word is dominant. And based on that, you can start clustering these cells. So in particular, I use something called K-means to do the clustering. First, you have to define what is the right K to choose. You use different metrics. They both agree K should be 2, so that's the clusters. And when you put them on the map, you see something very interesting. So I'm coloring the clusters as red and blue. And when you put them all on the map, you find something very interesting is that basically all the big cities you see mentioned on the map there, they're all red. And most other areas outside these cities are blue. So what this means is that the red cluster is somehow capturing the way that language is used inside major cities, inside metropolis, the more urban dialect in a sense. And linguists like to call this a super dialect because it's not a continuous area, it's little pieces. Now, you can confirm that here because you can look basically for those cells, what is the population distribution for the two clusters, and you see that indeed the red cluster has much higher populations in general. Even though there are much fewer cells here, there's only 180, and we have almost 1,000 left. So you can replay this game, get rid of all the red cells, keep only the blue cells, replay the clustering game, and try to find new clusters. And when you do that, you identify basically 3 new clusters. One that basically matches to continental Spain. A big yellow one that is basically Central America and a little bit of South America. And then another one that is basically the southern part of South America. And we published this paper back in 2014. And as soon as it hit the archive or something, I got an email from the people at Cervantes. They were very happy, said, this is great, you're doing this, we love it. But really, you should have used these other words instead of the ones you used and use more data. So, okay, give me the words, I'll do it again. So we got more data, we ran it to the different set of words that they preferred, and we published it as in their linguistics journal. So I actually have a linguistics paper. My one claim to fame. And we found the same type of results. But what makes these results interesting is that this division, actually here. So this area over here, this chunk over here, and then that one over there. This was actually how colonial Spain divided the Americas administratively. So each of these little areas had a different viceroy that was controlling that area. And it's amazing that 200 years later or 300 years later, you can still see signatures in the language of this political division. Question. So a 21st century tool showing us how culture and language is evolving over time. Yes?
We have a microphone here.
No, please.
I'll just speak up. Is that okay?
Well, there is a webinar, that's why they were.
Yeah.
So you see a microphone.
Michael. My question is and it's from your previous map, the urban centers had sort of seem to have their own super dialect.
Mm-hmm.
But could that be the result of media organizations being active on Twitter in those particular localities? You have, for example, newspapers, TV stations, etc. They all have their Twitter feeds, and of course they would be exuding or sort of using some kind of an official dialect of the language in that particular area. So it's not sort of a natural phenomena. It's essentially the result of a concentration of media in those particular areas. And then the follow-up question I had, in the next map, you can see sort of the traces of the sort of administrative divisions of the past. And then the question becomes, so the divisions that you're seeing, they didn't evolve, making the claim that they didn't evolve naturally, they're actually the result of policy differences or structural differences in how these areas were ruled. So, to what degree is this data natural, or is it the result of a sort of design differences in language use?
Good question. So, well, here we're using geolocation, and in general, media sources don't include geolocation in their tweets, so that wouldn't be a big factor. We do think that what you're seeing is actually the effect of the medium and the effect of basically internationalization of those cities, because you have people coming from many different places, and that tends to, in a sense, homogenize the language a little bit. Also, you have the bigger cities; they're more exposed to mass media, so and that creates another layer of somehow homogenization in these big cities. As for the other one, so I'm not arguing that this is not natural. I'm just saying that it's the consequence of a decision that was made to split the map in specific ways. And the way you split, and this splitting of the maps, in a sense, helps to isolate people. Right? So in the sense that the people who were living here didn't have much contact with people living here, the people living here didn't have much contact with people living there. So the language evolved naturally, but separately in this species. Yes, and also, of course, here you have different native languages than you have here, so you can absorb different terms in different ways. So it's natural, but it's in an interesting way. More questions? I mean, please feel free to interrupt me whenever I say something that's obviously wrong or not clear. Like most things. So we've looked at one language in detail. We zoomed in very carefully. Now let's see basically how languages interact with one another. These are language connections, and how basically people who speak more than one language are able to communicate with themselves and somehow bridge communities of different languages. So many people in this room will recognize this plot that I stole from Turkey many years ago. And this was a plot for hashtag Bahrain. Right? So this was during the height of the Arab Spring, and one of the candidates had an Arab Spring with Bahrain, and we were looking at these things, and we had seen something very similar to this when we were looking at the early days of Truth. We were looking at the GOP hashtag at that time, and we had seen that in these political type of discussions, you always have these two clusters. Oh, actually, I should mention. So the blue links here mean each node is a user. Blue links mean that one user retweeted the other. Orange links means one user mentioned the other. So you can see the difference between retweets and mentions. And like I said, we've seen this for political discussions. You always have two groups, Democrats on one side, Republicans on the other side. They only retweet each other, and they mention one another. So these mentions kind of bridge the gap between the two groups. So when I first saw this, I didn't pay much attention. I said, okay, maybe these are the people that are pro-Arab Spring, these are the people that are against Arab Spring, and they're discussing these things as they always do. Until one day, for some, I don't exactly remember why, we got a bit bored and decided to actually see what these people were talking about. And there, I had no idea what they were talking about. But one thing that was very interesting was one group, actually this group, was tweeting in English, and this group was tweeting in Arabic. And of course, people that speak Arabic retweet people that speak Arabic. People that speak English retweet people that speak English. You have a few people in the middle, like this guy over here, that can talk to both sides and actually bridge the divide between the two communities, and somehow are acting as a bridge between the two communities. So in sociology, we call this like a structural hole. Right? You're plugging the hole between the two communities and acting as a broker of information in a sense. So this brought, and I noticed this around the time where I was starting to get interested in this question of languages. So it was very, very interesting. So became interested in looking basically at how people speak multiple languages, so bilinguals. Of course, we all know that languages are all related to each other. They come from one another, they evolve. So in principle, it should be easier for people to learn languages that are closely related. So if you speak Italian, learning Spanish, maybe it's easier than learning Chinese, because the structure of the language is very similar, many words are similar, etc. Unless you speak Finnish or Hungarian, which are just weird languages. Live in the bush by the side. Nobody knows where they come from. In general, you can kind of trace the languages mostly to a common branch at some time in the past. Also, many languages share many common words. So here's a network connecting languages based on how many words they share to one another. Of course, Greek lives in the middle because we give up words to everyone. And you see the usual families of languages are very interrelated to each other that more or less map to the branches of the tree we saw before. So we know somehow that inside each of these clusters, bilinguals should be more common, should be more frequent, because the languages are similar, they're easier to learn, and you're probably more exposed to them for cultural reasons. But also, you know that some places make learning language easier than others. So here's a little cartoon. So they use basically the flag of the country to represent the language that they're speaking. And the wiggly lines kind of means like broken language, right? They're just speaking but not very fluent. If you're in Italy speaking bad Italian, everybody's very happy that you're speaking Italian and they'll speak Italian to you. If you try to do the same thing in France, they look at you and say, look, this guy's learning French. You get pissed off because they're destroying their language and walk away. And in Germany, if you play the same thing, they're very happy that they're learning German, but they'll still only speak English to you anyway. So different cultures somehow have an influence on this. So if we look at the way people speak multiple languages, we should be able to see signatures of these things. So we should be able to see that some languages, in a sense, are easier to learn to have bilinguals because they're more common and they're more related. On the other hand, there should be also a cultural aspect. So we built this network of languages. We call it, give it the fancy name of global language network. And here, each node is one language. And you're connecting languages based on how many people speak both of them. And here we define speaking both of them as meaning tweeting above a certain threshold of times in both languages. And of course, you have English in the middle, because it's like the lingua franca of the internet. Everybody speaks English to some degree, or most people speak English to some degree, so it has connections with many other things. You still see, so here the colors represent the families of the language, so you can still see some clusters around specific languages and specific language groups, but the picture is not very clear. So they said, okay, look, this is Twitter, it's a bit informal. Our language detection library is also not perfect, so let's do something a bit more reliable. And what we did was we looked at Wikipedia. So here we have a perfect definition of language. If it is the English Wikipedia, it is written in English. If it is the Russian Wikipedia, it's written in Russian. There is no detection, it's just what it is. We downloaded all the editions in all the languages of Wikipedia, and we analyzed all of them. And here we're connecting languages if the same person and the same IP address edited 2 editions. Right? If I go home now and write something in the Portuguese Wikipedia and then in the English Wikipedia, that creates a connection between Portuguese and English. And here the picture becomes a bit clearer. Of course, English is still the main hub, but these clusters that we saw before are starting to form more nicely and become more well-defined. And you say, okay, but this is all on the internet. People are tweeting, people are writing Wikipedia articles, so maybe these are kind of the same type of people, so maybe we should look at something more different. And here what we have are book translations. So this is a UNESCO data set that they've been gathering for a few decades now. That basically tracks how many times a book was translated from one language to another. And so if tomorrow you decide to translate, let's say, the Divine Comedy from Italian to English, this will be a new translation, so this will be a new link in this network. And here the picture becomes very, very clear. You have English in the center, as always, but now you see very clearly that you have other hubs as well. So you have French over there, because French used to be the language of diplomacy and science for many years. you have Russian over here because it kind of was the bridge during the Soviet Union between the outside world and the languages in the Soviet Union. So everything got translated to Russian and from Russian to the local languages and vice versa. You have actually in a very peripheral way Chinese over there, in this case Mandarin, and all the local languages around it. And here it's more peripheral because in a sense, they're so big and have so many speakers and so much of their own culture that they don't need to import as many things from the outside and they don't export as many things outside. So they can survive on their own, so they're a little bit more isolated. Arabic has the same problem, but I forget where they are exactly right now. Oh, here. This is Arabic. Here. Yeah. No, here. This is Arabic. So it kind of also a little help, but it's a bit isolated from the other languages because they also have their own little world in a sense. And you say, okay, so now we have these three versions of this network that are supposed to be capturing the same thing, like how connections between languages exist and how they mutually influence each other. So how do you compare these three networks? So what we did was we looked at the easiest, most simple way of comparing things, and we said, okay, we know that we have, in some networks have more languages than others, so they have more nodes. Some edges are present in one case and not the other because the nodes are there or not. So what we're going to do is we're going to compare basically the weights in the common edges across all pairs of networks. And what you find is a very, very nice correlation. And you find actually some interesting details. So the strongest correlation, around 66%, is between Twitter and Wikipedia. This kind of makes sense because these are the same type of people somehow. So the people, the Twitterati and the Wikipedia editors tend to be highly related. So we think they're very well connected. We also have a very strong relation between Wikipedia editors and book translations. Again, because Wikipedia is a more serious thing, it's more long form, so you have to be a certain level of education to be able to do it. And of course, the worst connections between Twitter and translations also because Twitter, like I said, is very informal. We're using just short snippets of text. But you can see that basically it's capturing something that's real across all languages, and it's somehow giving indications about the underlying structure of something that exists in the real world and that's actually interesting.
So their tutoring measures are not normalized by population.
So these weights actually are basically, they are conditional probabilities. So it is a probability of people that from this language speak also that language. So they're all normalized by the population. So that you don't bias it too much on English, because otherwise English will dominate everything, because it has the strongest and the largest number of speakers. And this is fine. Okay, so these are the connections between languages and how somehow maybe give you some tips on how languages influence each other. You can also look at how languages change and how they evolve over time. In particular, the case of American English and British English. So, of course, the idea of Americanization is something that's been around for a long time, not only in language, but also in politics. And some people approve of it more than others. And we decided to look at this to see how British or American the language is based on the place that's being used. Right? So if you grab a big map of all the tweets written in English, with your location again, you can start looking for specific words that are written either the British way or the American way, or that is a British expression or an American expression, and use this basically to measure how Americanized or how British size it is for a specific location, and they give it a score between -1 and 1. So -1 means completely British, +1 means completely American. You have many shades in between. And when you do that, and you replot that map of tweets, what you find, of course, is in America, people speak American mostly. There is a little area over there where it's more British, but that's Canada, so we don't count them. And they have a lot of influence from French speakers. But when you look at time more or less, But when you look at Europe, the picture becomes a bit more interesting. Right? So first, the UK still speaks English, still speaks the Queen's English, mostly. But you see an interesting difference between spelling and vocabulary. Right? So you see spelling is much darker blue, which means more British, while vocabulary are lighter shades of blue, which means more towards the American side. And you also see that in the rest of continental Europe, is that somehow vocabulary and spelling are evolving separately. And when you look at the country level, you can see this very, very, very clearly. Here the countries are ranked by how American their spelling is. And you find something very interesting is, first, the only countries that actually use British spelling consistently are basically the colonies: Canada, India, South Africa, Australia, New Zealand, UK, and Ireland. Everybody else tends to be more on the American side. But even then, on the vocabulary side, the vocabulary is much more Americanized than the spelling. So the reason for this, we think, is that while in school you learn British English in many places, especially in Europe, you go to school and you learn the Oxford's English in a sense. Then when you go home, you watch American TV, you listen to American music, you read American books, and you pick up all the vocabulary there. So you still write color with an OU, but now you're using different words that you picked up culturally from this mass media influence. And that's what explains this. Yes?
What about grammar?
Grammar?
Yeah,
I am not looking at grammar
that's
at
the
all.
third aspect that's also different. Right?
Yes. I'm not looking at grammar at all. I'm just looking at vocabulary and spelling. It would be interesting to look at grammar. It becomes a bit tricky because if you want to do like part of speech tagging in tweets, it's tricky because it's very informal. People don't always follow the normal rules, and it gets very messy. We tried playing with that, and at least you couldn't get it to work properly. And so this is the picture more or less of what we have right now. But it'll be interesting also to look at how the situation has been evolving over time. For that, what we use is Google Books. And here we have basically n-gram counts for each year for books published in the US and books published in the UK. And then you can look at the vocabulary, how the vocabulary in the US is evolving, how the spelling in the US is evolving versus the vocabulary in the UK, and the vocabulary and the spelling in the UK. Yeah. So this is what the vocabulary in the US looks like. So again, lower values here means more British, higher values means more American. And you can see it starts on the British side, of course, in the 1800s, and then it gradually becomes more Americanized. Vocabulary in the UK is more or less constant, with some variations more towards the British side at some points, and now moving a little bit higher up now. More recently, the spelling, the spelling in American books is actually very, very interesting, because you see this very nice kink over here, where it then kind of explodes towards the American side, and then it goes over there. And while on the British side, it's more or less constant until last maybe 30 years or so. Yes?
Can you tell us what's the historical definition of American English actually happens?
Good question. Right there. That's when the first American dictionary was published by Webster, and where he actually sat down and decided to simplify the spelling and convention and define the American spelling in a sense. Good question. And good timing. And so starting there, that's when we see basically the American version taking off in a sense. On the other hand, you see something very interesting over here, which is around World War II, where even the spelling in the US starts becoming more British for a few years, for a decade or so. And when you look about what's happening here, this is when you have a huge influx of European migrants coming in, both during the war and the years after the war. Actually, I was actually able to dig up the official census records for I want to say 1940, 1950, if I remember correctly. And those like the change in number of European-born immigrants in the U.S. changed by like 2 or 3% of the total U.S. population. So it was a huge change. And these people that were coming were not necessarily, in many cases, were not necessarily the poorest. They were better educated. They had access to enough money to buy a ticket on a ferry to come from Europe here. So in principle, they were more educated than average, which means that they would also start publishing books and contribute to the culture. The culture, which might explain this regression towards the British thing, because they were educated in Europe, so they were trained in Europe, so they were more biased towards the British way of speaking and writing.
Perhaps it's the spinal tap.
Possibly.
British invasion.
They turned it on to 11. Now, another interesting point is here, that around 1989, 1990, the Berlin Wall fell, and that's when you see basically the big change in the British side. Also around this time, you had the first dot-com bust, which was also basically when the internet started becoming dominant, and especially in the first few years, it was very American-based, so that kind of created another influence. So I think between these two events, I think is what explains this happening here. Berlin Wall, because it kind of settled, at least for the end of the Cold War, kind of set America to be like a dominant superpower, at least for a few years. Then the internet came along and further reinforced this cultural influence. So I think it's not exactly clear what's going on in these years over here, but I think that's what explains.
It's
Possibly. So we've looked at individual languages in detail. We looked at languages evolve over time. We looked at how languages influence each other. But one thing that's also very interesting is to look, like I mentioned in the beginning, is to use the language somehow as a proxy for the community that you're from. And the idea is that if you can determine that you live in New York and you're tweeting consistently in Italian, then we can assume that you have an Italian background or that you have cultural Italian heritage. So you can use this as a way of identifying communities within the city. And this is interesting because this global migration is a big problem, and it's getting bigger because there's around 250 million migrants in the world right now, including all of us that were not born in the US and are living in the US. So this defines migrant as anyone that was born in one country and lives in another. And the question then is, how well integrated are these communities? Of course, they're not distributed homogeneously. Many of them are in the US, many of them are in Europe. A huge number of them are actually in Asia, etc. And this, of course, creates some pressure both for these communities to integrate and assimilate to the local city, the local community, but also for the host communities to help them integrate. And the question then becomes, can we actually see how well different people, different groups are integrating within different communities? For this, of course, like I said, we use language as a way of detecting the community. We check, so here's an example. So this is the official census data. This is what we see through Twitter. So Twitter speaking in Spanish and Catalan, so that's the local languages. And we see that while there are gaps here, so there are places here where people live where we have no data. The places that we do have data match well to the places where the population lives. And you can do this in Spanish. You can also do the same thing in Portuguese. So again, the official census data for Portuguese speakers in Madrid versus what you see in Twitter, which again is incomplete, but what it exists, it matches well. So you can use this as a way of tracking. So, and hopefully this will convince you that we can use the language as a way of identifying where to live within the city. So based on that, we can look at many different cities. So here we have 53 of the largest cities in the world. and look at many different languages, about 30 or so languages, and start looking basically for each language in each city, how well integrated it is. We define basically a spatial entropy measure, which is this number here between 0 and 1, where that basically tells you if all the people speaking that language in that city are concentrated in a small number of areas. So if they have like a Chinatown, in the sense of their own neighborhood, or if they are scattered throughout the city. So they are well integrated spatially in the city. And immediately you see some interesting patterns in this matrix. So you see these horizontal lines that basically represent cities like London that are very good at integrating people from many different places, many different cultures. And you also have these vertical lines here that represent basically languages and communities that are very good at integrating in different places. So in this case, Spanish here, with some exceptions. So you see these two things, and you can also see that if you have this matrix, you can now start using this as a way of characterizing the cities and integrating and clustering cities based on how well they integrate the different communities. Right? And you can do that. You see that there's basically 3 natural clusters that immediately form. So you have one cluster over here. So here again, each box represents one language, and the color of the color of the box represents how well integrated that language is in that specific city. So you can see that. So you have about 5 cities here correspond to this big blue cluster. Then you have the red cluster in the green cluster. And more interesting, if you look at the cities that actually match each cluster, you realize that these are not. It's not that cities actually more. And now I'm coloring basically the cities based on the cluster that they've been assigned. And you can see immediately that it's not necessary that cities that are geographically closer to each other are not necessarily in the same cluster. So what this means is that somehow this clustering is picking up more on some type of cultural integration, cultural differences than it is on geographical similarity. It's not just that they are similar, that they actually behave in the same, that they are close to each other, that they actually are similar in the way that they integrate. Yes.
Why no cities from India or China?
We didn't have enough data there. So we wanted to have for each language, we wanted to have at least 1,000 speakers for that language for that city, and have at least, I want to say, like 2 or 3 different languages per city. So we didn't have enough data. So that's why you don't see anything in Africa. You don't see basically India or China, or even Vietnam, Korea, etc. That's why I started in the beginning saying there are limitations to what you can do. So we started, I think, with a list of the 100 largest cities in the world, and then we tried to find data, and then we ended up with 53, which is the ones where we had enough data to actually do. So you can also look country-wise and see basically which are the countries that are better at integrating different communities. So these are the top 10 weight, the edges with the top 10% weights, top 20% weight. And you find that UK is actually really good at this, mostly because of London and Manchester. And you can also look on the other side and see at the language, which are the communities that are less well integrated in general, which means that they tend to create their own neighborhoods and keep more of their own culture. Interesting. Is at the bottom 10% and at the bottom 20%. So you can see, for example, that Italian don't like the Philippines too much. So just to analyze, yes. Oh, there we go. Yeah, and the French and Arabic tend to create their own communities. They have their own neighborhoods. There we go. And the French community concentrate in specific areas, so they have their own little France or neighborhood, which is kind of cool. So I'm running out of time, I think, but to finalize. Online social networks basically give us an interesting view on how we interact with one another. and that you can use to study human behavior. The fact that we now have GPS receivers on our pockets means that we can actually see these behaviors, how they change from place to place. When you combine all of this with language detection, you can actually see how languages are changing from one location to another, and even over time, if you have the right data set, you can determine and define dialects based on how the language changes from one place to the other. You can look at how this global language network is defined around the world. English is becoming Americanized, kind of as a consequence of like American cultural domination. And languages can be used as proxies for communities that help you also see how the different communities are interacting. In a couple of weeks, there is a conference I'm helping to organize in Boston, so you guys should all come. It will be a lot of fun. And like I mentioned in the beginning, all of this work was actually done by my collaborators and not me, and there are many of them. Thank you all. Many of them are here in this room. Yeah. Oops. I don't know what happened. There should be one. Oops. Keynote got tired, I'm sorry. So, yeah, I don't know what happened to that slide. So if you have any more questions, I'm more than happy to answer you. Yes.
So when you were showing the UK US spelling vocabulary, looking at Google Books data, it seems to me that many of the explanations you're giving are mostly based upon kind of like media access, or like how certain things have access into certain communities. You're talking about the internet, and so by opening up the internet now, American English, for example, becomes more dominant and so on. Have you thought about trying to bridge, like really try to look more at the information diffusion, but really at the role of the possible media that are really like the carriers of the language that you're studying here?
In what sense? I'm not sure I understood the question.
Well, for example, books will spread or will spread in a different way than, I don't know, tweets or internet.
Yes. So I'm not sure how to compare those. It would be interesting to look. I guess if you could find like records of the popularity of different books in different places, that might work. At least between books and internet-based things. But yeah, it would be interesting. I have not thought about how to do it properly. More questions? Johan.
Not to dwell on it, but coming from a country that has a long history of language laws and language borders and regional parliaments and governmental issues related to language policy, etc., I'm wondering whether your data could be used to actually study the effectiveness of language laws. For example, in the case of Belgium, we have an effective language border that has been defined. For example, you can see that Brussels is like a French-speaking island in the middle of Flanders, right? There's language law that runs south of it, and there's official government policy that below that, the official language being used in commerce and in government must be French, and above that, in education, it must be Dutch. Anyway, so but in the case of Catalonia, it seemed to be. So I'm wondering whether you could use sort of the degree to which the particular language areas are. I mean, this is also true in Wales, for example, where there's an official policy to promote the Welsh language. So I'm wondering whether your data might actually shed some light on the effectiveness of language policy. I mean, if you look, for example, Brussels is sort of French speaking, right? Yes. But it's the specific result of persistent policy.
So this line over here is actually mandated by law.
Yeah.
Oh, no.
And so if you look south of Brussels, you can actually see some blue spots there. That's effectively the result of the language law. There's the border was defined. In fact, there's quite a bit of disputes about communities that happen to be above or below the border. And anyway, so what's interesting is that it might actually internationally allow you to see the effects of government policy with respect to use of language and its effectiveness.
Yes, it's very hard. I mean, using Twitter, it's very hard to see changes in time because the numbers of users are changing, it's increasing. Every now and then, Twitter decides to change the default settings on geolocation, whether it's on or off. So there's a lot of fluctuations and a lot of noise in the data when you look at the template. So in principle, yes, I would have to be very careful about how to choose the right data. I might be able to do it, for example, if I had some, let's say, a few thousand speakers that I know have been around forever on Twitter, and I would track them over time and see if they changed or they speak more in one language or the other. That might work.
Look at how crisp the distinctions
Yes.
are.
Yeah. Questions? Yes. People.
So just as a general kind of long-term prediction. So are we moving more towards some kind of segregated scenario where there are many languages, or something more, some towards like a universal language, like Esperanto or something?
Personally, I would prefer if there was a universal language because I'm a pragmatic person.
From there,
From there, it's not clear. Like I said, I can't really do temporal analysis very well at this stage. It seems to be that English is becoming more prominent in the sense that it's becoming more international. Many people, the easiest way for them to gain notice internationally is to speak in English or to write in English. But actually, that's the result I didn't show. But you can actually correlate. So if you remember this network here, so this thing. So you can actually, and the other networks as well. You can actually calculate the eigenvector centrality of each language in this network, and that correlates very well, very strongly in all three networks with the number of globally famous people coming from that language, the difference from that language. And of course, it's not necessarily, the causality doesn't necessarily go one way or the other, right? Because there are a lot of world famous people speaking that language became more central, but also because that language is more central, it was easier for someone to become world famous. And here we define world famous as being someone that has Wikipedia pages about themselves in at least 25 different languages. So really huge, Jesus, Obama, Trump, that type of people. And you see that, so the place where the language is in this network actually has a big impact, or is at least reflective of more cultural centrality, which is why you always see in all the networks English right in the center. Here you are able to see French as being a hub and more central because it was very central and very important for a long time. Same thing here for Russian, etc. So there is a very strong connection between the cultural aspect and the language aspect. It's not clear which way it's going. One, it's because it's becoming more central or central, or what's influencing what, but there is a symbiosis between the two. Yes.
Thank you for the great talk. So following up the question regarding comparing English versus American, and you mentioned that it's very difficult to do any grammar analysis on Twitter. So I'm really curious about, because there's an understanding of like a new grammar, a new language emerging from the internet, especially if you compare maybe a book to the tweets. Have you found anything interesting from that comparison?
I haven't looked at it in enough detail. One thing, I mean, this is something I've gotten from other people's papers. There is more or less a consensus that the way people write on the internet is not the way people actually write, right? And the people are able to distinguish between different, the linguists call this registers, and so the different contexts in which you're speaking. So the way you write on Twitter is not the same way you write an email to your boss. It's not the same way you talk to your girlfriend or your mother. So, and the people will speak differently. You can use all the abbreviations in the world while you're tweeting, but that doesn't mean that your language is becoming poorer because of that. But me personally, I've never looked at that in detail. There's another question.
Yeah. Do you, yeah, very interesting. So do you also look at the language itself, for instance, also relate to the size of the region, for instance, Dutch? And so Dutch people can speak like 8 languages easily. Because they are kind of, because when you take a train, 3 hours, you're out of Holland. And then you have to speak French or other Flemish or, in order to communicate. And you go to the TV in Dutch and they never translate English into Dutch, but they only have a subtitle. But if you go to Germany, many German people even couldn't speak English. Even they go to vacation, they have to go to Russia or Ukraine to the Holland, to the German-speaking town that they can speak German with them. They couldn't speak English. And in that movie, also not translate. The movie even translate the song in the movie into German. I was very surprised. I have a Chinese movie that I see a Chinese character sing a German song in the movie. So this is the like culture regional, because German is kind of, German is big, right? You take train forever, you're still in Germany. And Dutch is very open and they want to learn different things. So it's really to culture, regional, and other issue related to this. So this is one thing. The other thing for English in itself, like in Singapore, you have a Singlish. So they mix with Malay, Indian, English, and Mandarin. And I'm sure there, I mean, people always say we speak Chinglish because we have different words, but no English people will use it.
So just put la.
Yeah, there's many strange direct translation from Chinese. So even within the English, there are different culture mix, right?
We mentioned that a little bit in the American edition paper, that there are many other local dialects that are recognized. The British and the American are the most predominant. You have Singlish, you have one that's based on Swahili. So there are very different dialects and almost pidgins and creoles that are originating from English, specifically because English is everywhere.
Yeah, because Singapore is a really small town and everybody hectic, and we all speak different language. So Singlish is kind of like easily formed. Yeah. But if you have a big country like Russia, and you have different people speaking, but they're so spread out, and then it's not easy you can come up Russian English or whatsoever. So I think the regional size also play a role. For instance, like French and Arabic. French and Arabic is quite different language, but French has so many colony in Africa, which they speak Arabic. So that's why you can see that French and Arabic also go together. So this is also like geographical distance and.
And there's also a big influence of the language laws, like Johan was saying. Spain, for example, Italy, they dub everything on TV. So you hear a lot more Italian and a lot more Spanish in Spain instead, and a lot less English. You know, so that you notice that, for instance, by the way English was they're not as used to hearing it. But that also helps to, in a sense, to homogenize the language. Italy in particular has many local dialects. But everybody kind of converged and was forced to converge on Italian because that was the official language of Rai, in a sense. So it became the official language kind of by default because the mass media was using that language. And everybody started learning the language in school. But this is a relative, I mean, I don't know exactly when this happened, but it's a relatively recent thing. That Italian became the dominant over the local dialects. Yes. Bye-bye.
So the Ngram picture is really interesting. I think
the books one?
Yeah.
Okay.
They almost probably correspond to the general trend in like stock market of US, like the economic power of US versus UK. Of course,
it would be interesting to compare with the GDPs of the
it may be too slow to predict stock market, but maybe interesting to look at an economic factor versus like cultural export import.
Yeah, so it would be interesting to see. I mean, I don't know of any data sets about these cultural imports. It might be. I know there are actually. Everything that goes through customs like any merchandise that goes through customs gets recorded because you have to pay tariffs on it. And you can get this data set that I know. I don't know if you could look at that over the years and see basically how much cultural products, DVDs, VHSs, whatever, are coming from the what?
The trade networks, from either the World Bank or the World Economic Forum.
Yes, but that's global, right? So that's like how many billions did the US buy from China and how many billions? So it doesn't discriminate by type of product. We're trying to see the whole. It does. Oh, it does.
So that's what I was wondering about as well on Twitter, for example. A lot of the use of Americanized language, a lot of the use of Americanized language and spelling might be the result of the people simply repeating the titles of books and movies or TV series, right? So
Yes.
the data might be reflective of not cultural dominance or actual changes in the language, but the fact that Hollywood became
I mean, so
such an
that's
important-
but that's cultural dominance.
I would not call that cultural dominance. It's just where the movies happen to be made.
Yeah, because they're culturally dominant.
For example, it might be that a lot of the movie studios are in a particular region of India, and then when people are on Twitter today, have you seen so and so movie? Of course, they quote the title. They'll use the original spelling that might be the spelling wherever the movies are actually being made. So I wonder how much of not the Google books, of course, that might be different, but at least on Twitter, how much of it is people just simply telling other people what they saw on television or commenting on movies that they saw and therefore using the title of the page.
I don't know.
That would be an interesting thing to look at. Is that could skew the results towards
I mean, we removed the retweets and those things to avoid problems with repetition.
Yeah.
But copy pasting, I mean, you can't control for it.
Yeah, for example, famous movie titles, or you might have that was the movie database. You get a list of titles and then scan Twitter for those titles.
Like popularity of the movie.
That skews your results.
Actually, it's even Twitter when those popular person gets retweeted.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, that could be of course, you can explain as a cultural dominance, but it just happens. It's just a coincidence. It just happens to be one.
Just want to make America great again. And Belgium too.
It's already great. So. Okay, so
Any more questions? I'm happy to keep answering questions.
yeah, first I think we should wrap it up because it's 11:42.
Okay. Fair enough. And I'll be around the rest of the day. So. Yeah.